put the tracks in. So that's very difficult to replace. You think, well, maybe you can make it go around the marsh. And in fact, my dream marsh is this one, where it's really devoted as much for the fish and wildlife and urban protection as its main functions. There when I was working with my graduate student, Amber, who is a GIS specialist, I said, wouldn't it be nice if we could move the railroad? And she said, yes, I could do that. And so she comes up with a map where the railroad's been moved. At any rate, so this is, and I also put a causeway on Highway 12, so the marsh can expand outward towards the Air Force Base. But this is the way we need to be thinking. And what I'm saying is that this is all about reconciliation, trying to figure out how do you make your management of landscapes compatible with maintaining native species. Now look, I've talked briefly about Putah Creek. I'm doing pretty well with my time here. I want to have time for discussions. That's one reason I talk so fast. I hope that if you don't want to slow me down, you'll have more time at the end. Let's say a little bit about Putah Creek. This is you've heard quite a bit from Rich Marovich, so I'm not going to say too much about it. And Rich is, as I'll say, is just an amazing guy. This is a biodiversity hotspot in an agricultural landscape. A classic, if there's ever a classic example of a novel ecosystem, Putah Creek is it. It's so different from what was there historically. And that's why it's called a test case for reconciliation ecology. You look at this landscape, it's totally altered from what it was. Here we got this amazing, some of the best ag land in the world with this little narrow shred of habitat going through it. And historically, of course, the creeks would flood and spread out across this landscape. This was a vast swampland, a lot of it, swamp and grassland. It was not what at all like you see today. But in fact, one of the first things the farmers did when they moved into this area in the 1850s and 60s was to dike the creek. Then what that did, it caused these big floods when they didn't breach the dikes. It caused these big floods to go down this narrow channel and then size this thing into the landscape. So now you have sort of a canyon where historically you had flatlands where it just spread out. And the Indians knew how to handle that. The Patwin lived on, there were natural levees. They lived on these natural levees. And they also had ways of figuring out which years are going to be really wet. We just move away during really wet years. But obviously we don't do that. We want a stable landscape. So here's this really altered system in a highly productive landscape. 95% of the flow is diverted to Solano County. I'm sure Rich has told you about that by the Putah Creek Diversion Dam. And so the question then becomes, what do we do? How do you make this? Why is this such a great system? And of course, this is one of Ken's photos. You'll have seen a lot more of his photos later on, I hope, in a future talk. Ken's stuff is just amazing. We have Chinook salmon spawning in the creek. That was unheard of a few years ago. And they have a huge potential for becoming even more abundant in the creek. But this is the way that's kind of Ken's photos. This is one of my photos from a few weeks ago, which I had my crew out there were surveying salmon, and you see them standing in the background. There's a female Chinook on the red, and what I show this picture is one thing. You see how shallow the creek is, but also you notice there's junk in this photo. This poor salmon is digging around a steel bar. You can see there's all kinds of other stuff in it, but you can see actually a remains of a wagon wheel that's in this. This is Putah Creek. This is a creek that it's a little better where Ken works, but most of the creek is more like this. This is a system which still needs a lot of work. And it's also the alien fish are really abundant in the creek. And one reason I like sampling the creek with my classes is I can go out there and get 20 species of fish, half native, half non-native. Students don't care; they're learning about fish. So, and if you catch a big fish, everybody wants to hold it, even the carp. But this is what you see when you look at the fauna of the creek, the flora and fauna of the creek. That it's this amazing mixture of native and non-native species. This is percentage of alien species of all the major groups: trees, shrubs, butterflies, reptiles, birds, and so forth. And you see the birds do pretty well. Only a small percent are native and non-native, but that includes starlings, and pigeons, which are really abundant out there. But this is a system which every part of it is an international collection of species of plants and birds and mammals and insects. Again, an international collection that are all working together. And You know, if we just let it go, what you'd find is a few of the alien species would take over much of the habitat. That means you have to actively manage the system. And one way of that, of course, is through the flow regime.
So, hey, what's the, I guess it's one non-native reptile?
That's the red-eared slider, the turtle.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And maybe the snake.
Oh, the water snake.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't gotten those in Putah Creek yet, have we?
Somebody recorded one.
Oh, is that right? Oh, I hadn't heard that. Okay, let's hope not. They're mainly in
I hope
Sacramento.
it's a rumor, but that's what I...
Yeah, there's an eastern water snake. There are probably maybe 2 species that are present over by Folsom. And I hope they don't spread. They're a really nasty, they're a snake I grew up with, so I know, and they're a really nasty snake. They're not poisonous, but they bite. And they like to be in water. Anyway, that's the kind of, but that does reflect the kind of issues we have to think about. How do you prevent new invaders? And if you do get a new invader, do you make a decision to undergo a control program? Because I would assume, for example, if this natrix, or not natrix anymore, this eastern water snake invades Putah Creek, somebody has to make a decision. Do we undergo a control program? And once you're committed to that, you're committed to doing it indefinitely, just like they do for Arundo donax on the creek, this invasive shrub. Those things like this, you have to, when you're thinking about reconciliation, you're constantly thinking about how we can manage this ecosystem to make it work best for native species. And you have to be involved in active management, which means a lot of work for citizens, which is great. And the Putah Creek is so many people involved, it makes it one of the positive aspects of it. So how did Putah Creek become a reconciled system? You've probably heard about this from Rich, but basically when I first came to Davis, it was a mess. It was a place I didn't even take the students down to very often. But once, you know, as the area got more developed, people got more interested in the creek, we had the lawsuit, we restored flows, it became a place that now people are proud of. And this it wasn't a rapid thing that happened overnight. It took a long time. That's also, I think, what we're talking about. You know, and one of the symbols, of course, is that when I first started working on the creek, Detroit riprap was a common phenomenon. There were hundreds of car bodies along the creek. And now it's one of these places that you see all kinds of things going on. A lot of kids involved, a lot of the citizens involved, and landowners involved in installing weirs of various sorts. There's just a lot going on at the creek, and a lot of it is involved with people, with the people from the local communities really liking to have this creek in their backyard and working to maintain it, because it does take work. But that means we humans are an integrated part of this ecosystem, and we're the drivers of what the ecosystem is like. And it takes all these various involvements here, you know. And I like a plug for the Solano Water Agency. They lost the lawsuit, but after that, they became a very positive force on managing the creek. They've really been quite doing everything they can to make everything work. And then Rich Maravich, you heard last time, we're so lucky to have him as a streamkeeper. Actually, one of the things that's also really good, the fact we have a streamkeeper position, it's funded by the Water Agency as a result of the lawsuit. But if we had more streamkeepers in California, someone whose job was devoted to coordinating everything goes on in the creek, being in charge of getting volunteers, working with landowners, we would have a lot more creeks that are doing as well as Putah Creek. And I think it is a potential model for other watersheds. And the most recent model, unfortunately, it's one in deep doo-doo right now because of the local congressional congressman, but the San Joaquin River, 150 miles, that's basically following the model of Putah Creek to restore it. I don't know what's going to happen with it now, but this is the vision. They have spring run Chinook salmon up by Friant, fall run Chinook salmon dominating down here, native resident fishes and non-native fish. That's very much the Putah Creek model. And having a living, where now you see these dotted areas are places where it's dry, having this a living stream for its entire length is the goal. And when that happens, this is going to be an asset to all these communities that are in the area, as well as a great place for fish and birds. But I say right now, there's all kinds of issues going on in trying to make this work. but it is a model. And the last model I like to talk about is Blue Creek. This is up on the Klamath Basin. It's a tributary. It's the lowest most creek to the tributary to the Klamath River before it hits the ocean. Lowest or most major tributary, I should say. It's in the fog belt, so it's a forested landscape. This is a landscape that the upper reaches are a wilderness area, but most of the lower watershed was owned by the Blue Diamond or Green Diamond Resource Management Company, the Green Diamond Timber Company, as they used to be known, and managed as a forest for logging. As part of an effort to really protect the creek, recognizing that this is a major and really important tributary to the Klamath River, negotiations have been going on with the Yurok tribe and the Western Rivers Conservancy. I happen to be on their board, and I got involved because of Blue Creek. This is creating Blue Creek as a tribal park and salmon sanctuary. Let me explain a little bit of what's going on here. And why this is so important, and also an example of reconciliation ecology. For one thing, the forest looks great. It's in the fog belt. It's going to be, even with climate change, it's likely to maintain itself. But it's been a working forest for a long time. There's very little old growth in it, but the forest really looks good in many respects. The Blue Creek flows through it. The upper part, say, is wilderness area. The lower part is what the Western Rivers Conservancy has been raising money to acquire for the Yurok tribe. And what's great about this is that the Yurok tribe has agreed to be the managers for the indefinite future. There are people living on this land. When I've been up there with them, it was really wonderful. Where this photograph I took here was, they were on for the first time on a village site they hadn't had access to for 100 years, and now that land was theirs. So they're determined to make Blue Creek work as a salmon sanctuary, because one of the things, they have a lot at stake. They have a salmon fishery, a tribal salmon fishery, and they want that fishery to keep going. And the creek is not only important as a spawning area itself, but there's a big pool where it flows into the Klamath River. That pool is where these fish hang out. Any fish that's migrating up the river usually stays in that pool for a few days to cool off, essentially, as they're moving upstream. So it's a major refuge site. So the fishery you can argue the fishery of the entire Klamath River has some dependence on Blue Creek. But also part of this whole deal is that the Western Rivers Conservancy has also acquired land that's on both sides of the Blue Creek and other watersheds to maintain as a Yurok tribal community forest. And this is the idea that the tribe will use this as a working forest, so they can make a living. This is an impoverished tribe. They don't have a casino, and the salmon fishery has been in deep doo-doo for them. So they're looking for ways to be able to live off that land. So here's an idea. Here's a place where you're trying to really make humans an integrated part of the landscape, but at the same time protecting it for the indefinite future. And what the Yurok tribe has done is given up a lot of their tribal rights. When the negotiations went on to acquire this as a salmon sanctuary, they agreed to give up, to obey the Endangered Species Act, for example, which they don't really have to do as a tribe, as a sovereign tribe. They've agreed to give up some of their sovereign tribal rights in order to maintain this as a sanctuary.
Is this where they've discussed the genetically altered salmon?
I don't believe so. They're very concerned about hatchery fish in the system, and that is a problem. Actually, hatchery fish there are more hatchery fish in the system than we really like to see. But it's the best place I know of in the lower river for wild fish. But I haven't heard anything about genetically altered fish in here. As I say, I wrote a blog about this a little while ago, but these are salmon holding in that big pool at the mouth of Blue Creek. But again, this is an example of, this is probably one you can call restoration if you want to, but it's really reconciliation, because the tribe, one thing, we have to recognize that tribal peoples have been part of the California landscape for thousands of years. So we don't have a real pristine landscape, if you recall that, if it's human free. And the Yuroks were a very abundant people for a long time on this river. So they're, in a sense, renewing their interactions with this landscape. So we really see that Blue Creek as being an advancement where you have a group of people who are promising to take care of it, At the same time, they'll make a living off the land and be able to stay there, and that's really important. So at this point, 30 minutes, that's what I was shooting for. I'm happy to have questions, comments, discussion over all this stuff I went over very fast.
I've got a question
Yeah.
that relates to the Klamath River, and over the past few years, there's been a program to reconcile the interests of farmers and environmentalists and Indians, and it's a hard fought battle, and they finally, after many years, came to an agreement that looked like it was going to be accepted by all parties. And then Congress last week passed a spending bill, basically shot the entire project down. Would you say that was an example of reconciliation ecology, the concept, and how would you comment on what Congress did to that program?
Oh yeah, that actually even relates to Blue Creek. That, for those you don't know about it, there's 4 dams, 4 or 5 depending on how you're counting, 4 dams on the Klamath that are scheduled to come down. And this was resulted only because of a major negotiations between the power company that owns the dams, the fisheries agencies, the farmers upstream who get a lot of water from, the farmers in the Shasta and valleys and so forth, as well as the native tribes. All these groups were negotiating, and they came from very opposite points of view, and spent a couple of years under very intense negotiations, and actually finally came up with a compromise agreement that I agree would be a great example of reconciliation ecology, because the idea was that you would take down these dams to provide salmon access to large chunks of the watershed they've been denied access to. At the same time, there were guarantees put in there that the farmers would continue to get the water and power they needed from various means. Unfortunately, the expenses taking down the dams, $250 million sort of the minimum cost, and that was in a congressional appropriation which was shot down in this last, again, the Republican Congress basically decided they didn't want to spend the money this way, which is, I'm still hopeful because that agreement's in place. People got together. I don't think anybody who was involved in that process wants to give it up. And so this is a big blow, of course, because they were working for years to reconcile this system, to make everybody as happy as they could. And even the fact that even the power company finally went along with it tells you that this is a pretty good agreement. But part of the agreement is, of course, somebody has to pay for it. The power company says we're only willing to pay for so much of it. The U.S. government, there's people have to pay for the rest of the dam removal, and that was part of the agreement. We'll see what happens. Right now, things don't look very good. Everybody's sort of saying back to the drawing boards, but still that agreement's there. And with if the local people in Siskiyou County and so forth who are interested in this can really work on their congressman, maybe that could be changed in the future. But it's really tragic because this is something that I thought everybody was thinking this will be the premier example of a reconciled river system, and instead it's back to fighting if we don't figure something out, because there's going to be continued controversy over how that water gets used. Yeah.
I do have a question in regards to the Endangered Species Act that was enacted in 1975. I just read an article about 6 months ago in the Sacramento Bee that had to do with, let's just take the sea lions. They say there's 300,000 of them. They're producing 50,000 pups a year. And I'm just wondering, when it comes down to the decreased places for salmon to spawn, if it's time that we take a look at sea lions to maybe start hunting them again or something. One more comment I'd like to make also about seagulls. I used to fish the West Fork of the Walker as a child, and the fish were so abundant there, I mean, it would be like walking on rocks almost. The fish were that thick. But if you go up there now, there's just literally thousands of seagulls. And I don't know how they could be endangered, but like I said, there used to be lots of fish.
Well, actually, you're hitting on an issue that falls very much in the realm of reconciliation ecology, and for the sea lions and seals, that's the Marine Mammal Protection Act that actually protects them. Nobody wants to deal with that issue, because you're talking about culling marine mammals, cute marine mammals. Though nature's doing a pretty good job this year with the ocean being so warm, we're seeing people are getting very upset about all these pups and things that are found starving on the shore. But that's perfect. That's really a natural thing to be happening. Yeah, we've gotten ourselves into an interesting bind because we're protecting these mammals, and they are competing with humans for fish. They are changing the ecosystem they're part of because there's so many of them, because there are no controls on their populations essentially right now, except natural environmental fluctuations. And that's what's going to happen with these populations. We'll see more of these incidents of stranded animals will be seen as we get bigger populations, because as populations build up, under good times they'll do just fine, but then you'll get these warm years, the El Nino type years, and their populations will crash. And we'll see lots of them washed up on the shores, and people will moan and groan about it, but that's partly it's natural, but it's also partly because we don't want to deal with controlling these populations when they're healthy. I don't have any solutions, because there's nothing that's more controversial than trying to do anything that involves killing marine mammals.
Yeah.
Or in the case of the same thing with the gulls. I don't know which gulls they are, but I assume they're the same gulls that nest at Mono Lake. There's a certain amount of that's natural, but again, we've allowed gull populations to build up to high levels because they feed on trash. They're an example of a very successful bird. And again, nobody wants to talk seriously about controlling animals like this. So that's where we as humans have to be thinking seriously about our role as stewards of these